So we'll start with the first slide. And I'll just tell you a little bit about my background as an educator, as a parent, and as a homeschooler. My background is in cultural psychology. That was the first master's degree that I did so long ago, decades ago. And what I studied there at the School of Education at Harvard was sort of how culture dictates family life, and then how family life sort of develops personalities. So it's this sort of society down to the individual, how culture sort of influences who we become. And it was fascinating to me because, you know, you grow up in a sort of cultural atmosphere and you don't really give any second thought to it. It's just like the air that you're breathing or the water that you're drinking. And, you know, as you get older, if you're taught critical thinking, you can sort of see where your ideas come from and decide whether to accept or reject what you've been taught. So I graduated from that program the same week I had my first child. So I was a parent, new parent, and I was ready, and I thought I was armed with the tools and understanding I needed to protect my children from those undesirable values in the broader culture. Mainly, you know, knowing that how I grew up, I had a lot of anti-Black beliefs and thoughts and feelings, even though obviously I'm Black, and that was very painful, of course. And so, you know, I thought that I was equipped with the knowledge that I needed to protect my children from that, just because I was aware that it was coming from the culture and, it, you know, it would go down to the individual level. So I figured, you know, I just make my home sort of a barrier, stop those undesirable values at the door, and just protect my children. This is a picture of my children. I have 3 girls, and as you can see, 2 of them are lighter complexion and 1 is a more brown skin like myself. And so I was particularly sort of protective of the youngest because I knew that being the darkest in my family was also, you know, it's not just about being Black, it's about how dark you are. It gets down to so many detailed levels of your self-perception because, you know, our society says that lighter skin is more attractive, and nobody has to say that sentence ever to you for you to get that idea. And you can, you know, you get it when you're very young. And so sort of our take on it is that as adults, we have the tools to name these values and these ideas that are coming to children from all directions. And in naming the values, we give the children and ourselves the power to reject the things that we don't actually believe. And if we don't name them, we just sort of let them absorb these ideas, and they end up just passively accepting them. And at some point later, hopefully as adults, you know, they get more aware. But it's really empowering if we're able to name it and, you know, describe where it's coming from and help children reject the undesirable ideas as children. So so this is just, you know, this slide is just sort of listing the things that we get from culture, our ideas about what's normal, what's useful, and what's good. And the normal ideas are almost the most sort of difficult and challenging because nobody has to say it and nobody ever sort of challenges it. You know, we can sort of be explicit about teaching our children it's good to be truthful, it's good to be this and that, and, you know, in order to be useful to society, that's why you're in school and you're going to study and you're going to do this and that. But as far as what's normal, that's just what's accepted, and that's what, you know, we assume is regular. Like to have a name, you know, that's Anglo is normal. To have a name that's hard to pronounce is not normal, right? And so these are things that we just sort of pass on without even thinking about it. Our child rearing practices, even though, you know, these days people are sort of more intentional and really read up on different ideas about how to be a good parent and things like that. But nevertheless, you know, you have sort of acceptable and unacceptable ideas about child rearing, and that comes from culture. Relationships, how we relate to each other, our beliefs about race, conscious and subconscious, and how we talk about race, and whether we talk about race. All of these things are sort of, you know, at the broader cultural level, they have a certain understanding, and then we have to choose as parents and as people who work with children how to pass these values on. So we'll go to the next slide. And I chose this image just because it sort of epitomizes the ideas that I feel like I'm up against. You know, when I had 3 daughters, and my girls are Black and Muslim, but you know, you don't have to be to that level of you know, a minority to have these messages coming at you of what you're supposed to be like as a girl, or you know, just you know, different ideas about what's normal, what your role is in society, how you gain value, you know. And so being a princess, you know, is sure, you can argue that, you know, each of the stories have morals and values, but at the end of the day, you know, the image of the princesses are all very similar, despite the differences in, slight differences in skin tone and things like that. So this idea of what you're supposed to look like and what you're supposed to act like. So my challenge was, how can I nurture my girls' self-confidence? How can I help them resist the dominant cultural messages about what is normal, what you're supposed to be like as a girl, and what it means to be Black and Muslim? Because you know, those identities are not readily available, you know, in normal sort of mainstream culture. So how do I sort of expose them to some messages about who they are that says, yes, we're normal too. So my idea, you know, like I said, I graduated and I had my baby and I was like, I'm ready, I've studied this, you know, I know what I need to know. I thought I'd just keep the TV off. You know, like these images are coming from TV, and I knew that it was the visual part that was sort of most salient, you know, as a girl, at least growing up and thinking, what am I supposed to look like? Because we're so taught that, you know, if you just look right, you know, then you'll be okay. Needless to say, just leaving the TV off did not take care of this. I discovered that we cannot block out the society we live in. If you leave your house ever at all, you are absorbing the messages about, you know, about who people are based on the groups that they belong to. The thing is that children observe and notice, and that's their job, you know, like all through childhood. You know, that's why we don't have to teach them language, they pick it up. Their job is to learn constantly and to observe and figure things out. So what happens if we don't actively fight against harmful messages about race is that they just consume the racist ideas that are around them. And you don't have to be racist either, you know, subconsciously or consciously. You never have to, you know, say a racist thing, but just living in this society, if you're not actively teaching them where ideas about race are coming from, they will pick up racist ideas. The good news is that racist ideas are not natural. So when you intercept those messages and speak with children about it, it's actually fairly straightforward, and they get it so easily. You'll be amazed. Especially the earlier you start, it's very common sense to them. But when you talk about it in terms of power, then they can sort of understand what has happened, how we got to where we are, and how nonsensical racism is. But avoiding the subject, which is what we tend to do, is detrimental, because they will try to make sense of what they're observing. And in the absence of information, they'll fill in the blanks in a way that ends up blaming oppressed people for their own oppression. So on the next slide, I have a map of Boston and the surrounding areas. Now, most of you are in Wayland, and so you're probably well aware that Wayland is much less diverse than some of the other areas closer to Boston. So if the children in your community ever go into Boston, it's nearly impossible for them not to notice that racial segregation is a fact of our society. Right? I lived in Milton, which is just outside of Boston, and still, you know, driving from Milton through Boston, like Dorchester, over to Brookline to visit my mom, my children would notice just those two town lines. And one of my children, when she was about 4, asked, "Why is Boston all dirty and only brown people live here?" And that was a shock to me. I grew up in Mattapan and Dorchester, and of course, you know, living there and going to school in Brookline, I noticed that, you know, there was a big difference between the inner city and the suburbs, but I never would have said it in that way to my mom or to anyone really. I sort of internalized it as shame because I was from Boston. And so I sort of blamed myself for living in a, you know, less beautiful neighborhood. And, you know, so in the absence of that conversation, it was just a lowering of self-confidence and just a, you know, a feeling of shame. And when I shared this with my mom, that my daughter had said this, she said, yeah, you know, it's hard for children because the world appears to have a winning team and a losing team. And the winning team seems to be white people who have more of the resources. And the losing team seems to be people of color. And so why would you want to be on the losing team? You know, it's pretty simple. Some other things that my children have said, you know, my brown skinned daughter, who's very confident and, you know, she's been spoiled and she knows she's beautiful, but she still has said that she wished she had light skin. So it's, you know, no matter how confident you are and how much you've been built up, there's still this acknowledgement that, you know, this is valued more than what I have. So if we allow them to notice these racial differences and don't help them analyze the power dynamics and justice issues in society, then they're just left to conclude that, okay, the negative messages that I get about brown and black people are true, first of all, and they're the fault of those people, rather than they're the fault of a system that has this, you know, entrenched history that was purposeful then and needs to be actively dismantled now. So, you know, this is all just to say that they are noticing, whether they're saying so or not, and that, you know, we need to be active in helping them to sort of label what they're observing and sort of understand it. Books are the other source of input that I really underestimated. I thought that reading was wholesome without limitations. I thought, you know, as long as your nose is in a book, you're learning and you're getting smarter and everything's great. And my oldest daughter started reading very early. And so, you know, I thought that was wonderful. I ended up learning as she sort of digested what she was reading and expressed her, you know, her feelings about it, that when you rely on Eurocentric books, you are communicating values about what is normal, what is good, what is beautiful, etc. So I had to be more intentional about inclusion and representation. And so, you know, this is, you know, my sort of approach to this has to be a certain way so that my children can see themselves. But all children need to see a wide representation because, you know, even if my children were white, if they were only seeing Eurocentric literature, they would be coming to the same conclusion that, you know, it's normal and good to be white, and being other than white is abnormal and not as good. So I think we'll go to the next slide, and we'll talk about noticing difference in life and in books. So like we said, children are noticing race, color, and difference all the time, whether they talk about it or not. So our job is to normalize difference and interrupt messages that assign differential value to different groups. So it's completely okay to notice that, oh, that person's brown, that person's dark, you know, that person's hair is different than mine, right? What's not okay is to say that that person's weird or that person's hair is not normal, or, you know, to assign value, differential value to the differences that we notice. So one thing that we can do is to normalize difference in life, right? As we're driving around, you can see, you know, I don't know how often you go into the city, but if you drive through a neighborhood that has clearly different, you know, population, you can mention it you know, you don't have to just sort of hope your kids don't notice, or, remain quiet about it. Or if they say something about it, you don't have to tell them it's rude to notice. You just, affirm that observation and offer some vocabulary about race. When you're doing that, it's going to be an ongoing conversation. It's not going to be just one and done, like, okay, we mentioned that we drove through a neighborhood where there are more African Americans. No, you go on and you touch on it the next time you pick up a book, or when you're watching the news and something, maybe there's a protest, and you can talk about, maybe there's a connection between the fact that people who look alike tend to live together. Why do you think that is? And, how do you think that affects the relationships between different groups? It's an ongoing conversation forever, really. We're all still learning. So you want to become aware of your surroundings, offer your own, the things that you're noticing, offer vocabulary about power and justice. And this is simple to do for children if you just use the terms of fairness. They're very keen. I'm sure you've noticed, especially if you have more than one child or you've worked with a group of children, children notice everything about fairness, right? Everything has to be fair and equal. So when you use that language, it's pretty, you can get pretty far with talking about resources and how things have been in history and how that carries over into the present. And then, our topic tonight is carrying those discussions from books into the real world and vice versa. So you want to sort of talk about what you see in books. And I chose these two books as I Got Next takes place in the inner city. And Westlandia takes place in the suburbs. And so, children who are exposed to both of these kinds of stories and both of these kinds of environments and worlds, even if it's, not extensive, they'll see that, it's not about one being better and normal. It's just about there being different experiences. So books can be a safe starting point for opening conversations about race, which can then be carried into the real world. Or it can go the other way. You've had a discussion in the real world, and then you can open up a book and, sort of extend that discussion that you got started on. Go to the next slide. This is a book that presents some research on different schools and the results of naming racial justice issues. And so they studied different schools where in some schools they were sort of talking about the issues and sort of engaging in discussion, and then some schools where they were not really talking about it at all, and then other schools where they were not only talking about it, but doing projects where they sort of engaged in some sort of action to try to create change in society on some issue that, some issue of fairness or justice that meant something to them. And so the interesting thing about this is that the outcome of not only learning about it, but trying to create change is that the other measures of success, success on test scores and, college completion and things like that, those also see an uptick when students have had an opportunity to engage in these conversations and try to create change. So it's to our children's benefit and it's to society's benefit to really try and get them to use the language, the analysis, and action that will affect society. I'm gonna just check if there are any questions. Okay, I'm gonna go on to selecting books. So we'll go to the next slide. So when you're thinking about what books you want to read aloud to children, it's important to be aware that although we are seeing, a lot more books coming out that show diverse experiences, it's still, the world of children's books is still overwhelmingly white. In this study of books published in 2018, we had 50% of children's books representing white characters, 27% starring animals or other non-human characters, and then as you can see, 10% African American, 7% Asian, 5% Latinx, and 1% First Nations. So altogether, the characters of color make up less than the non-human characters, which is really striking. And we just, you know, when you think about not just population, but the world that we're trying to represent to children, the world we're trying to show them. We have to be intentional to seek out diverse books, or you end up, you know, if you're just picking up what's on the shelf in front of you, you may end up presenting a skewed picture to children. So some tips on choosing books to bring into your home are requests from the library, or if you're a librarian or teacher, things to bring into your collection or your classroom. You want to pay attention to the power dynamics on the page. So this is, in addition to, you know, who's in the book, you want to see what they're doing in the book, you know, who's speaking, who's looking, who controls the narrative. And these tips are on your handout that you'll get tonight. You want to scan the books for offensive or dated language and images. When you sort of want to share a book with children, but you're questioning or you've been challenged, you want to sort of question yourself and ask yourself, okay, why am I getting defensive about this? Where is this coming from? If you're uncertain, sort of dig deeper, you know, try and get curious instead of just deflecting it and saying it's fine, you know, because there's always, if someone has objected to something, it means it's hurting someone, you know, and so you want to really get to the bottom of that and figure out if you're putting your sentimentality or your, you know, something else in the way that's actually going to cause more harm for the next generation. You want to evaluate the overall message or messages. Are minority cultures represented as, you know, just equal, or are they represented as something different and substandard? You want to look for windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors, which is a term coined by Redeem Sims Bishop. And that means sort of books that offer children a window into someone else's experience, a mirror reflecting their own experience, or a sliding glass door where they can really enter into the world of someone else. And this is important for all children. So whether your group of children you work with is diverse or not, you want to have sort of a wide range of experiences represented. You want to familiarize yourself with diverse sources for book reviews. So if you look on your handout, there are links to many different blogs and review sites that sort of specialize in, for example, Muslims in Kid Lit or disability in Kid Lit, things like that. So you want to sort of stay up to date on what's coming out and what people are really recommending. You also want to make sure that you're sort of giving preference to own voices books, which is a term coined in 2015 by Corinne Davis, I'm not sure I'm saying that right, who's a co-founder of Disability and Kid Lit. And own voices books are the books that sort of, where the creator, either author or illustrator or both, share an identity represented by a main character in the book. So these are preferable to books that are just about, you know, for example, people of color, but the author is white, because sometimes you may not recognize something that's in a book it's not necessarily offensive, but it may just be inaccurate or, you know, not quite getting the experience right. And then someone who is from that culture may read it and not find themselves reflected and not find it to be a mirror. So you want to try and give preference to own voices books. On the next slide, we have, this is a book list that we did in the summer that's sort of responding to the social and emotional needs of children during this year of change and trial that's been difficult for all of us. So this is a good place to start for diverse picture books, and that link is on the handout. I think we'll go to the next slide, and these are just a couple of books that, I've enjoyed with my children. I really found that my children prefer books that represent them doing normal things, just having fun, just being kids, rather than something that's about, being Muslim or about being Black or about Black history. The freedom to see oneself in many different ways is one of the greatest privileges that white people have and take for granted. And, it's something that, I didn't realize, because I love history, I would like to share Black history and, show, some of the great things in our past, but it ends up often emphasizing struggle and emphasizing racism and, the challenges we've encountered. And so you just have to observe children to see what effects the different kinds of books are having on them. And you want to make sure that your collection or your reading experiences with children reflects books that are about normalcy and joy in the lives of people of color, and not just about challenge and trauma and struggle. So let's see. So just to end, you want to model lifelong learning. As adults, one of the biggest lessons I've learned as a parent and especially as a homeschooler is that our learning never ends. And so, while you're sharing vocabulary and analysis and history with your children, you can constantly be learning more about what has happened in the past and, how resources are sort of shared or not. And, as you learn, you can sort of give pieces and bits and pieces that are age appropriate to the children you work with or live with or are raising. Race, power, representation, all of these things are things that, we learn more and we absorb more every day. So make it an ongoing conversation that is open in both directions. So your children know they can always talk to you about, what they're observing. There's nothing they can say that's wrong, though, you want to make sure that they're using vocabulary that's not harmful. So it's an ongoing process, and I encourage you to just continue to try. So we'll go to Megan now, and you can continue to put questions in the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Autumn. I'm sure that your comments and your sharing has really sparked a lot of thought and questions in the audience. I've been taking notes myself over here as you've been talking, because I want to highlight a few things as I shift gears and talk about bringing this topic to books and to talking with kids about race and social justice, using books kind of as a springboard and how to do that. So one thing I want to acknowledge right away is that I don't know who's in the audience. And so I don't know the life experiences or values that you're bringing to the table. I want to say, as a white person engaging in this work, I think it's really important to center the voices of Indigenous people and people of color in conversations about race. And so I want to highlight a few voices that were kind of pinging around in my brain as Autumn was speaking. And one is from a trainer from my town, Amherst, named Pat Romney, who's a psychologist. And I went to a training that she led at Simmons University when I was teaching there. And it was an anti-bias training, and it was about teaching for excellence in the classroom. And one phrase that she gave me that I often say to myself and that I've used when talking with my kids, I don't have a slide, but this is a picture. Sadly, my youngest child isn't there. I guess the 7th child. I don't have a picture of him here, but this is my family. We're a diverse, multiracial family. 4 of my kids are Black, 1 is Puerto Rican, and my youngest 2 are white. And so anyway, what Pat Romney said in this training was, biases are stories you tell yourself about other people before you know them. And I really love that idea because it kind of diffuses the shame in having biases, because we all carry biases around with us every single day, and they are contextualized in our society. And I think the key is that as we tell ourselves these stories about people that we don't know, or sometimes people we do know, the key is to be open to having your story changed by the person themselves, to be an open, active listener to people when they tell you who they are, when they challenge preconceptions, assumptions, or biases that you might have about them. And books can be an excellent tool in this, and books can welcome kids to build positive perceptions of other people, and also to challenge negative ones that they might have absorbed. And by people, I mean not just groups of people, but individuals that they encounter in their day-to-day life. And I also want to acknowledge the fact that, as Autumn was saying, you know, we need to normalize talk about race as part of our social justice work. I think that as a white person, I know I was definitely raised in a way that was like, let's just think about everyone is equal, and color doesn't matter, that kind of colorblind perception. In the words of Toni Morrison, white people are often socialized to believe it's polite to avoid naming race or to avoid talking about race. And that happens to this day. It certainly happened when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s in Vermont, one of the whitest states in the Union, and it's happening now. And a key way to be an ally in anti-racist work and anti-racist life is to challenge that. And just a very quick story about one of my kids, one of my white kids, Jesse, who's 5. He's doing remote kindergarten right now, and he does his kindergarten remote sessions in my office. And so I'm like right there every day, seeing him interact with his teacher and his classmates. And his group of classmates is relatively diverse, lots of white kids, a few kids of color. His teacher is white. And recently they were talking about, she was teaching them sight words, and she was teaching them I am, and then saying, you know, fill in a description at the end, and their kids were all going to write I am. And so she turned to Jesse, who's growing up with all of these brothers and sisters of color. And she says, okay, Jesse, you finish the sentence, I am. And Jesse unmutes his little iPad and he says, I am a white person. And his teacher just kind of looked at him through the screen like she didn't know what to say about that. And I thought, okay, so here's Jesse saying he is a white person, which is true. We talk about race a lot in our family because we're a multiracial family. And she didn't quite know how to handle it. And so she just moved on to the next kid. She goes, okay, good. And then the next kid says, I am a big brother. And she was like, oh, that's great. You are a big brother. And I was like, okay, so Jesse got a really different response because he was naming whiteness. And that is not something that a lot of folks, especially a lot of white folks, are really comfortable with doing, but we got to do it. And one thing when we're talking about race with white kids that I think is super important to do is to convey the message that they can be anti-racist and that they can affect change by challenging racism in their life. And there's a book that came out recently, here it is, that I find useful in kind of giving me language to talk with kids about race. It's called Not My Idea. And it's a book about whiteness. And it really says to kids, no, racism is not your idea. You didn't create it, but we swim in it, we live in it. And so what do we do about it? And changing it into a point of action, I think, is what can be really, really empowering. And can diffuse some of the shame that can then center feelings of white guilt, which is not an anti-racist way to be. You don't want to spend all your time talking about guilt. You want to actually do something that's going to change society. So those are some things that I wanted to highlight as I shift gears into this talk about, well, where do books come in with all of this? And so this first slide introduces the whole book approach, which I created as an educator at the Carl, which is really more of an aesthetic or structural approach to thinking about the picture book. My book goes through the whole book approach and how you talk about the jacket, you talk about the end papers, you talk about all the parts of the book to get kids engaging critically. And what I've found time and again is that by offering kids the opportunity to respond to design and art, conversation often very naturally shifts into talking about ideological concerns, talking about race and identity and representation, because kids often gravitate to talking about characters. And when they're talking about characters, they're often going to end up talking about issues of representation. And so here's where my real philosophy about reading with children comes from. It comes from something called transactional reader response, pioneered by a scholar named Louise Rosenblatt, who said this marvelous quote that I use all the time: "Books do not simply happen to people, people also happen to books." Books do not simply happen to people, people also happen to books. And if I believe that, which I do, then that means we can all read the same book and have radically different responses to it. So at story time, whether I'm working with a big group of kids or just a few of my own kids, what I try to do is allow for those responses to happen. Because I firmly believe that meaning does not exist in the book itself. Meaning does not exist in my interpretation as the grown-up reading a book aloud, nor does it exist in the kids. It exists in the space that is between those three things, in this triangle here. So what I want to do is create a really dynamic, interactive reading with kids so that I'm not reading to them, I'm reading with them. And children are the ones who get to build that meaning, to make sense of the book that we are sharing together. And part of that making sense might be to resist a book, might be to say, I don't like how that book treats brown people, or why does the girl never get to do anything in this book? And creating that space for critical conversations around representation. With the idea, and this goes back to what Autumn was saying, that part of what we're doing here is we're giving kids critical thinking skills that they can bring into their independent reading, so that when they are not reading alongside us or with us, but instead reading a book on their own, they might bring those questions forward. So my oldest child, who's now 23, when he was in 5th grade, all the kids in his class were like, or probably mostly the boys actually, were reading Tintin comics. And he really wanted to read them, and he brought them home from the school library. And I was like, oh, Rory, I am really not a fan of those books. I do not like how they treat brown people. And because I was familiar with them and their kind of colonialist view and their caricaturist, racist depictions of Black people in particular, but also Native Americans. I'd seen the books and I was not a fan. And he was crestfallen and he was like, you're not going to let me read them, but everyone's reading them. And I said, no, I'm not going to not let you read them, but I'm going to let you know that I really don't like how these books treat brown people. And I'm going to let you come to me and talk to me about that if you find things that you find upsetting or hurtful or anything like that. And he was like, great, I get to read these books. And the reason I let him read them was that I didn't want him to feel further marginalized as the brown kid in this classroom. There were other brown kids too, but I didn't want him to feel on the outs. And so he read them and he came to me later and he was like, you know, I totally get what you mean. Like, I see why the kids in my class like this book, but I don't like how it treats brown people either. And so we had the conversation, we had the entry point. And so we had that because I wasn't reading the books with him, but I had held the space to talk with him about them. And because, you know, for his whole life, we had had all of these back and forth conversations during shared reading that enabled us to then have a conversation when he was reading independently. We'd established that trust and we could have that conversation. Now, here are 2 other quotes that I want to give you. Reading the world always precedes reading the text. I think it says text. My face is blocking the last word in the quote, or the book, the word. Oh, that's what it is. Reading the world always precedes reading the word. In other words, we bring our own context to our reading. That's another way of saying what Louise Rosenblatt was saying about how people happen to books. And then this other piece from poet and children's book author Lucille Clifton is one that I really cherish. We cannot create what we can't imagine. And I cherish that quote because to me it speaks to radical imagination, to the idea of transforming our world for the better and saying, if we can imagine it, we can create it. That's the corollary, right? And so what I want to do is give kids books that invest in that radical imagination, that allow them to see how things could be, not just how things are or how things were, but how they could be. And this in part goes to what Autumn was saying about not only sharing books with kids about marginalized people that emphasize struggle and hardship and pain. There is need for those books. Absolutely. I'm not saying we sanitize history or that we don't talk about hard things, but we have to give a full picture, including that radical imagination of what yet could be. And this, of course, isn't only about books about Black people or books about Latinx people. I just had a memory of doing a workshop at the Carl on diversity and inclusion, and a Jewish librarian came to me and she said, you know, part of what I struggle with is the lack of representation of just secular Jewish life. Or she said, frankly, anything that isn't holidays and Holocaust, or holidays or Holocaust. And I was like, you're right. Finding secular representation of Jewish kids is hard. And I mean, this was in the days before PJ Library, which I think has done incredible work to advocate and make change in that space. If you don't know PJ Library, look up PJ Library. Good stuff. So practically, what are some tools that you can do to engage in these conversations with kids? One thing that I love to do is draw on something called visual thinking strategies, which is foundational to my creation of the whole book approach, where I would ask open-ended questions to engage visual literacy. Because as Autumn said, the images often create the impressions that kids carry forward with them about diverse representation. And so if I can ask kids, what do you see happening in this picture as I start a book? I'm creating, or I'm asking them to create an emotional and a cognitive investment. And then I say, what do you see that makes you say that? I'm asking for evidentiary thought, the cornerstone of critical thinking. And then what else can we find? That says, let's dig deeper. We don't need to just have a surface reading. We can really get into a discussion. So let's say I did that with this book, Wings by Christopher Myers. What do you see happening in this picture? 9 times out of 10, kids will start to talk about the character who's flying. And they might say, well, I see a boy and he's flying above the sky, or above the buildings. Now, one way that I might move into critical literacy practice with that statement is I might say, and I have done this with this book, well, what do you say that makes you say, what do you see that makes you say this is a boy? Because the book isn't called The Boy with Wings or The Boy Who Could Fly or anything like that. It's just called Wings, and we see a character. So how does the illustration cue you, child, reading this picture, to assign masculine pronouns or to say this is a boy? Well, the short hair and the clothes and the body just looks more like a boy. And so I welcome that kind of evidentiary thought, in part because what I want to do is expose how we are cued or prompted to read gender into a figure. Because there's nothing here that's definitively saying this is a boy, right? And so we are cued to that. In that response. And then if no one mentions the blackness of the character's skin and face and hair, then I might say, like, well, what else do you notice about this boy? What color is his skin? Or I once had a child say, well, we don't know if that's his skin color or if this person is just all in shadow. And they were looking for the word silhouette. They didn't have it, but they were looking for it. And so that's just an opportunity to name race, to name skin color, to invite the discussion to move in that direction. Because when we name it, then we can have those conversations that can be liberatory and empowering, and that can be anti-racist. in our discussions. I had a child once say, you know, oh, he's like a superhero and his wings are kind of like capes. And another child said, no, no, I think he's an angel. And I was like, okay, so now these children are absorbing an image of a Black superhero, a Black angel, and that is powerful that they are retaining that, because it is what a critical race theorist would call a counter narrative or a counter story to the dominant discourse, which says superheroes are white or angels are white. These kids now carry this other image of Black angel, Black superhero. Now, other art and design elements that I invite kids to talk about are orientation. So is a book in portrait layout or in landscape layout? I asked them to look at the end papers of a book. So here's a book I'm going to be looking at with Autumn in a moment, Black is a Rainbow Color. And I might just open up to those rich Black end papers and give them a chance to talk about it as an artistic choice. Front matter, the title page, the dedication page, the use of the gutter in the layout, or the seam that bisects the verso or the left-hand page from the recto or the right-hand page, and the back matter. So these are images from a book called Hands Up by another student from Simmons, or former student from Simmons. She's now a doctoral candidate at Cambridge, Brianna J. McDaniel. And when I've read this book with kids, we've talked about the portrait orientation of the book and how it supports the movement of hands up again and again in this joyful depiction of Black girlhood. And at the very end, you can see up in the upper right corner of this slide, there are these hands up carrying these signs in protest and in celebration. And kids have made the connection that the portrait orientation of the book supports that depiction of that hands up movement again and again. So as we're doing all of this, talking about art and design and holding space to move into critical literacy, I find myself turning again and again to a Google Doc by a librarian from, I think she's from Grand Rapids, Michigan, named Jessica Ann Bratt, who created this guide to embracing race at story time. And these are some of her key points, some of which Autumn has already mentioned. They're also in your handout. And I'm happy to say, I don't know how public this is, so maybe it's a little bit of a secret, but you're getting inside information. Jessica Ann Bratt is writing a book about this topic. I believe it's going to be coming out from ALA, from their in-house publishing arm. And it's just going to be such an amazing resource. I heard her speak at a conference. I turn to this resource all the time because it is so clear and plain spoken in its advocacy for talking about race with kids, starting really young and saying it's okay to point out racial differences, share your feelings about race and racism, use fair and unfair. We go to that all the time in my home and in my professional story times as well, because kids get that. They don't understand race as a social construct, or the difference between systemic racism and individual acts of meanness. Like, that's a lot for very young kids to understand, but they do get fair and unfair. Embracing differences and reinforcing that different and weird aren't the same, as Autumn was saying earlier, and respecting children's curiosity by admitting gaps in your own knowledge too, by saying, like, I don't really know, or we should find an expert about that. All of these points, I think, are really important as we engage in these critical conversations. Another resource that we've listed in the handout is from a Canadian scholar named Lisa Paul, Reading Other Ways. I gave you the VTS questions. What do you see happening in this picture? What do you see that makes you say that? What else can we find? Which you used in concert together, just create really dynamic conversations. These are other questions that can kind of nudge the reader to thinking about power dynamics in representation. Whose story is this? Who is the reader? When and where was the book written? By whom? That kind of gets into the own voices question that Autumn was asking. Who is named and who isn't? Who gets punished or praised? Who speaks? Who is silenced? Who acts? Who's acted upon? Who looks? Who is observed? all of these questions, they might just kind of pop up as you're reading. Keep them in your back pocket. I'm not saying go through every single one in like a checklist, but they might come up very naturally. I'm thinking about when I teach about the early reader book, like the Cat in the Hat books or Dick and Jane books, those kinds of old guard things at Simmons, I would often share a page from an old Dick and Jane primer and ask that question: who speaks and who's silenced, who acts, who's acted upon? Because so often Jane is going, look, look, and it's Dick who's, you know, riding the bike or playing with Spot or doing whatever. And so right there, baked into this very simple early reader narrative, are these gendered gender roles, that's the word I'm looking for, where the girl is passive and watching and the boy is active and doing. And it's not just in like old Dick and Jane books that happens everywhere, right? Now, in order to support children's critical engagement, the adult facilitator at Storytime or reader, you need to welcome diverse and maybe conflicting responses, stretch beyond your own readings and interpretations, which can be hard. That is why I have this book, Yo Yes, here. And attend to power dynamics within the reading transaction. Now, while you're doing that, I think it's crucial to keep children of marginalized identities to protect them. And especially if they're sticking their necks out and saying like, I don't like how this character is depicted, and they share that identity, you know, hold space for them without allowing someone to jump in and say, well, you know, you're not right about that, or that's not right. Like really hold space for them as they make themselves vulnerable and speaking up. And also just consider the authority that we grownups have over all kids, that if someone is saying to you in the context of a story time or a classroom, like that's not how I feel, or I feel differently, to welcome that, because it takes a lot of guts for a kid to speak up. So I'll close before I shift gears back to doing something collaboratively with Autumn, by just sharing what happened when I read Yo Yes once in a classroom environment, which was majority white. There was one little girl who was there who's African American. And when I started reading Yo Yes by Chris Rashka, a book that I really loved, that I thought of as, you know, taking two characters who were different from each other and bringing them together, this child spoke up, and she didn't like this book. And she spoke up when I read the first words of dialogue where the Black character says yo and the white character says yes, and she said, I don't like how he talks. And I said, who? And she said, the Black character. I don't remember if she said the Black character, but she said him, and I understood that she was talking about the Black character. And I said, why don't you? And I was immediately thinking that she was internalizing something negative and sharing it. But she wasn't. She said, well, I think that when you meet someone, you should say, hello, my name is, not yo. And I said, okay, well, tell me more. That was my way of holding space for her. Tell me more about that. And what she ended up doing, and then her classmates ended up doing, was resisting what they saw and what she led them to see as a false racial binary, where she saw this Black kid in these kind of sporty clothes and this white kid in these nerdy clothes, enacting racial stereotypes. And she saw that at the very beginning, and they critiqued it as we went through. Now, one kid said, I mean, even the Black kid has a basketball on his shirt, and that's not every Black person plays basketball. They were really resisting. And I didn't say to them, well, my Black kid thought that was the flag of Japan on his shirt, because it wasn't my place to say that. These kids were having this conversation, and I wanted them to have it. So I held space for it. They deconstructed this false racial binary that they read in the book, and it changed my view of this book. Now, I don't read this book now and think like, oh, this is a horrible racist book. I say, this is a complicated book, and we can read it in a way that we can see two people coming together across differences, and we can see it as reinforcing those perceived differences as well. And what I'm interested in doing is not saying bad book, good book in a case like this. There are some books that I will say bad book and I will not share them because I find them harmful. But with this book, I see it as a book that can really open up rich, brave conversations Now, that phrase, brave conversations, comes directly from EmbraceRace, where Autumn and I have done some work. And I encourage you to check out EmbraceRace as a resource if you haven't. In fact, they're doing a webinar tomorrow on a topic very similar to this one. So if you want part 2 of this, go ahead. I will be there watching because they just have some amazing resources. And now what I'd like to do is invite Autumn to come back to unmute herself. And I'm going to share a book, at least part of a book, called Black is a Rainbow Color, written by Angela Joy and illustrated by Aqua Holmes. And I'm going to, as I read it, engage Autumn in some questions and talking about this book to kind of model this a bit. It's clearly not the same as me reading this book aloud with a group of kids, but I hope that you can get a little bit of a taste. And then if you visit my website on the page, which is just my name, Megan Dowd Lambert, on the page about the whole book approach, there are also some links to different videos of me doing this kind of story time with kids as well. So you can find that. So the first thing I'll do is just hold up this book and say, what do you see happening in this picture, Autumn?
I see a girl who's got a small smile and she's looking at me.
Okay, so you notice this character right here and you decide that she's a girl and she has this little smile. She's looking right out at you. And I wonder, why do you think Aqua Holmes, the artist, decided to make this child look out at the reader? Because she could have made her look anywhere, right? So why do you think she made her look right out at you?
Maybe so I'll want to pick up the book, because when someone's looking at you, you feel like you're involved.
Okay, so she's really engaging us. She has this little small smile. She's got her eyes looking right out at us. And what else do you notice about this girl?
She's got sort of a glow. There's like light on her face, and she has an afro puff and earrings.
Okay, so she has these little earrings on. Her brown skin is kind of lit up with this light hitting her face, and then she has this afro puff. Now, when I look at that and I see you, or I hear you describing her, I start to see something angelic. Maybe it's because I was just talking about wings. Angelic about her, almost like she's got like a halo around her. Now I'm going to open up the book so that we can see the back of the jacket too. And how can you connect these two images? We see one picture here and one picture here. Can you make a connection?
I think it might be the same girl.
What do you see that makes you say that?
She has a similar skin color.
Okay.
And we can't see her face on the back. And she has different clothes on. She has a flowered dress.
Okay, so here she's wearing a purple dress, but here you notice she's wearing a flowered dress. Any other connections you can make between the front and the back?
On the front, there's a rainbow, and on the back, it looks like she's floating in the sky.
Ah, so on the front, there's this rainbow behind her. In the back, she's floating in the sky. We don't see the rainbow anymore, but you noticing the rainbow also made me notice this kind of rainbow of crayons or markers next to her. And that makes me start to wonder if maybe she's an artist, maybe she created that rainbow background. We don't know. One thing I like to do with picture books is take off the jacket to see if the case cover is the same underneath, because it isn't always. And so sometimes you get another kind of artistic treat. Here it is the same. And so that means I'm going to open up the book and look at the end papers. So what do you see when you see these end papers here?
It's just a deep black.
Just a deep black. And can you make a connection to the front?
Well, black is what the book is about, because it's called Black is a Rainbow Color.
Okay, so we connect to the title, Black is a Rainbow Color. So we go from this kind of bright, vibrant rainbow to all black here, this rich, deep black of the end papers. Any other connections?
The writing is in black.
So the type itself.
And the girl is outlined in black.
Okay, and the girl is outlined in black as well. Now, this is an opportunity where in a story time, I might say, and what about the girl? Is she Black too? To see if kids can make the leap from talking about Blackness as a color to Blackness as race, as a word we use to describe race. And maybe they might say, well, maybe she calls herself Black, but her skin is really brown, which is really what this book grapples with, that the author's daughter said, you know, I know I'm Black, but I'm not really Black, and was showing her arm. And then Angela Joy took that moment with her daughter and transformed it into this really lyrical text that's talking about Black as, yes, a color, but also a race and culture as well. So then we move into the title page. And what do you see happening here, Autumn?
Sorry, I'm going to open up my version.
Oh, good.
So I see the words again, but they're in slightly different colors. And I see a black bird in a cage.
And what else can we find here? You've named the words again, different colors, the bird in a cage. And what else do you notice about this picture? Why do you think the artist put this here?
The cage is open and the bird is half in and half out.
Mm-hmm. And what do you make of that?
I think the bird can go free if it wants to, or it can stay in the cage.
Okay, so as we keep moving, we're going to start to see different pictures that we might interpret literally. This is a girl looking out at me smiling, and then we might interpret them metaphorically. So this is a picture of a bird in a cage. Maybe it's free, maybe it's trapped, and then we could move forward. I'm realizing that we want to leave some time for questions that have been coming in. So I'm not going to keep moving through that book, but I hope that that gave you just, first of all, a glimpse at that gorgeous book, which if you don't already know it, I encourage you to find it. It is on our EmbraceRace list, right, Autumn?
Yes.
Yes, good. And so it's on that list. You can certainly find it. And Autumn and I collaborated with folks from the Diverse Book Finder, which is a project out of Bates College in Maine, and another remarkable resource that I recommend you take a look at. They are a diverse book finder. You can go in and try to find books about different groups, and they will give you an analysis of the books as well. They're not recommending all the books in their collection, but they're describing them. They're collecting them and describing them. And that's one thing that, going back to what Autumn shared, the statistics from the CCBC, this is just listing the number of books published, not the number of good books with this representation published. So these numbers of books about people of color, they shrink if we're talking about what we want in front of our kids, because of course books are still published that have all kinds of problematic content. So that's another layer to add to this conversation. So go to the Diverse Book Finder, find this book, Black is a Rainbow Color, and the other books on our list. And Autumn, was there anything else you wanted to share before we move over to some more questions?
I don't think so. We can go ahead into the questions. There was a question if you could stop sharing your screen so that they could go back to speaker view.
Oh, okay. Sure. So this is just the way to contact us. If you want to follow up after the webinar, you know, I teach much longer workshops and classes on this kind of content. So cramming it all into an hour is difficult, and Autumn has a wealth of other resources that she can share too. So please do follow us, follow up with us on social media or through our websites where you can find email links if we don't get to your question, or if just something comes to mind in the days and weeks to come that you want to follow up on. I know we would both welcome that. So I'm going to stop the share now. And Pam, are you going to share the questions, or should we take a peek at them? How should we proceed?
We don't have, can you guys hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah, we don't have that many questions right now, so I'm fine.
Oh, okay.
Can you see the questions on the screen?
I can open up my Q&A.
And
Okay.
and you can pick and choose.
Okay, sure.
That might work better.
So
Unless you'd prefer that I read them, I can do that too.
I'll just field one right here. Megan, black as a rainbow color is good for what age group? So when I get questions about age group, I go back to the whole book approach, and I want to say, you know, any picture book can be great for most age groups, and it's the discussion that you have and how you build from it. And so black as a rainbow color, I think, you know, I've read it with my 3-year-old, I've read it with my 5-year-old. I don't think my teenagers have deigned to sit with me and read it. I wish they would. But I really think that it's a book that is affirming of Blackness that everyone should be reading, honestly. And then how do you have the conversations? One thing I will say is there's a new book that just came out called Sometimes People March, and that's also on our EmbraceRace list. And I read it with my 3-year-old and my 5-year-old, and we were talking about protests that are happening now, protests that have happened historically. And one lesson I learned from that conversation is that my 3-year-old's sense of time is not the same as my 5-year-old or my 15-year-old, certainly. And so when we were talking about how in this country there were laws that said Black people and white people couldn't marry, because that's one thing that this book covers, my 3-year-old internalized that, and he didn't get that that is not the law now, even though we talked about the protests and the change in the law. And so he said to my sister, who is white and who is married to a Black man, you and Uncle Lee can't be married because Black people and white people can't get married. And he was trying to make sense of it. And she looked at him and she was like, why do you think that? And he said, well, it's said in the book. And so luckily, you know, my sister knows me and knows our values and knew that that wasn't something I was advocating that my child absorb, but she let me know he had absorbed it. And so then we had the conversation where I was able to say, you know, we read that book, and you're right that that used to be the really unfair law in this country. And it also used to be that 2 women couldn't get married or 2 men couldn't get married. But now our law in our country changed, and you can marry who you love. And so his concept of time did not allow him to absorb that book. So that's, I guess, my caveat to read all the books and have all the conversations, is that developmentally, you might hit some snags, and then it's how you handle those conversations in the aftermath that are going to make the big difference.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, you know, it's that comfort, which takes a while to sort of develop, but that comfort to come back to the conversation without shaming anyone who has misspoken. You know, I know that, like, with cancel culture and everything, you know, it can be hard to shield yourself even from this feeling of, oh no, if I say the wrong thing, like, it's ruined. But, you know, especially for children, you know, you want to make sure that they're free to say what they're thinking, and just let them know that words have power, and that, you know, they do need to be careful how they express themselves, but to not shut it down and say, you know, that was just wrong to say, and then have them not understand and just figure, okay, I can't talk about race. So it's always ongoing. Let's see. Okay, maybe we'll just go in order. So Laura, hi Laura, my college roommate.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. How am I talking to my children about social unrest? I think we can both answer this. I'm sure you're having more conversations than I am. As I mentioned, my children sort of avoid any conversation that stigmatizes them. And so even, you know, well, not to get too political, but the last election, I was disappointed, and my daughter got very upset that I was so upset. And it just really affected her emotionally. Like, you know, what's the problem? Like, this isn't such a bad thing. What is wrong? Why are you so upset? And so, you know, sometimes the way in which things enter the house can sort of have almost more of a negative impact than just sort of shielding them from it. So I go back and forth whether that's a cop-out or whether it's protecting them and letting them, develop their self-esteem before sort of taking head on the weight of the world. But that's the way that I've handled some of the unrest. But in general, when we do talk about it, it's just in terms of fairness. It's not fair that this is happening, and we've had so many conversations about history and about how the things that happen in the present are a result of the past and of not facing the past, that it's very simple to have these just sort of updates on, yes, this has happened again. It's not because individuals are necessarily racist, it's because our society is racist, and this is how we operate. They get it pretty quickly. That's how I've been sort of moving through it. How about you, Megan?
I mean, my teenagers obviously have a different awareness than my younger children do. My teenagers don't want to participate in some of this or most of the social actions that I've been going to, or have gone to historically. I haven't gone to many since the pandemic, but in years past. And, I've had them show up anyway, sometimes, not always, but, we protested the family separation at the border, and we went to a vigil soon after the 2016 election. And I just said, I'm not going to make you come to everything, but I'm going to have you be present, because history is now. This is happening now. And as you look back, I want you to know that your family stood up against things that we thought weren't right, and that we included you in that standing up. I mean, right now, in my neighborhood, I live in a really progressive area, and my neighborhood, most houses have Biden-Harris signs and or Black Lives Matter signs and or, all are welcome here signs, like most people do. There's one house in our neighborhood that we walk by very frequently that has a big Trump-Pence sign out in front of it. And my 3-year-old, who can't read yet, knew enough in terms of letter recognition to understand that that was a sign he didn't see everywhere. And so we would be walking by and he'd be like, what does that sign say? And I said, well, that one says Trump-Pence. And he said, we don't like that one. And I said, no, we don't. We disagree with that person because we don't think that he is the right person to lead our country. So we're not voting for him. And it was striking to me that he had enough, not only letter recognition, but just general awareness of our conversations and our values, that he saw that sign and knew it was different from all the other signs that we see in our neighborhood and the ones that are on our front lawn. And so that was striking to me. And I guess that was one conversation we've had. And then otherwise, I mean, my brother lives in Portland, Oregon with his partner. My brother's white, his partner is Black. And, we've had a lot of conversations about how safe are they and what are they doing to stay safe. And also hearing from my brother about how the stories about what's happening in Portland are really being overblown in a lot of ways and how the media is manipulating them. I've had more of those conversations with my teenagers than my little ones. But just saying, that Uncle Sean and Auntie Carol are there and they're safe, and they're keeping safe, and they're also out there making art and doing things in order to assert their values. That's something that I think is so important, is to tell kids what grown-ups are doing, because I think in our culture so often there's this kind of passing the buck, like, oh, the next generation will save us. And I'm not into that. I want kids to know that grown-ups are the ones who are affecting change, as much as I think it's valuable to say, oh, the Parkland kids or the kids in doing climate change activism, they're out there and they're empowering. Okay. And what are the grown-ups doing to get out in front and affect change by voting or activism or whatever it is we're doing? Sorry, that was very rambly. I guess I'm having a lot of conversations and lots of different stuff.
Yeah. So the next question is, what are some of the benefits of homeschooling when it comes to embedding racial social consciousness in your children? That was actually one of my motivating reasons for homeschooling. because I knew that a lot of what I picked up in school was this just subliminal messaging about what is good and what is normal. And that was both a factor of who I was around and, you know, how things were not said and sort of ignored, you know, in the whole colorblind philosophy. So I saw homeschooling as an opportunity to not only let them feel like they're normal, but to also, you know, sort of explicitly teach some of the things that would sort of help them understand, you know, their history and the value of where they come from. So yeah, I mean, you basically have more time together, you know, so the messages that they were getting from things, they're just talking to you all day long, you know, so there's that, you know, what they're thinking because they're always around you and they're comfortable to just talk. I think that was probably the biggest factor because, you know, you can't respond to what you don't know. So, you know, you see what they're reading, you see what they're absorbing, and then you hear how they're processing it coming right out of their mouths. So, yeah, lots of benefits there, and it's hard and it's tiring, but you know, I think all in all, it's worth it. I think my kids are a lot more confident than I was at their age, and I still am probably.
Well, I think that, I mean, I'm not a homeschooling parent, but I've been one by default since the pandemic. Our district is in emergency remote learning, and we decided as a family to opt into remote learning, at least for the first semester, even if students end up going back. And one reason was just so that we knew what to plan for. I didn't want the uncertainty of like, oh, what's going to happen this week or next week? Like, I just wanted to know, we've chosen this is what's happening for the semester, for my sense of stability and also for my kids. And it's been hard, but it's also been such a gift in so many ways. Like, my 10th grader is taking American history right now. And so, you know, I know more than I would if he were just in school, because he's doing it at home all the time, and we're checking in and we're having all these talks about what he's doing and what he's learning. And I think he feels like I'm a little too hands-on right now, but I love it. Like, I love that chance to really talk with him, and sometimes to get in the way of stuff too. And then with my 5-year-old, like, if he had said, I am a white person in the middle of story time in his classroom, I wouldn't have known that. But I was there, and so I heard the interaction with his teacher, and so I could then talk with him about it afterwards and follow up and be like, that's so cool that you named your race, you know, because that's part of being an ally, is really getting out there in front of it. So yeah, it's that opportunity to be present and engage.
Okay,
So we just have about 5 more minutes. I'm wondering if
questions.
we
Speed
have
round.
some great questions here. I don't want anyone not to get answered. So let's see.
So the top one is quick. The terminology or language we recommend for naming African-American characters, Black, African-American. I say Black unless the ethnicity is specified. If it's like a specific, you know, story of an African-American person in history and that's important to the story, then I'll use African-American. Otherwise, I use Black because that's what, you know, we have in common. So
I think the next one is for you too, Autumn.
So how as a white parent do we avoid the tourist perspective of noticing when we are in an area of people of color if our area is not very diverse? If we come from a white Metro West town and are having an experience in Dorchester or Mattapan, like, yeah. That's a great question. You can, instead of pointing it out at the time, you know, you can maybe over dinner or later, you know, you can say, so what did you notice about Dorchester? How is it different from where we live? Or, you know, just so that it's not just a quick interaction like, oh, everybody's Black, or, you know, you can have a conversation about it where, you know, you notice the experience overall. And, you know, that was just an aspect of the experience, kind of like how Megan did with the cover with the boy with wings, you know, like his Black skin is just one aspect of who he is. That's my thought.
Yeah. So, and then for immigrant parents who did not grow up reading the traditional American Western books that most kids here may read growing up, what are your tips in screening content or messaging that may be racist, inappropriate, since parents may be pressured to say, if your friends are reading it, you can too, without being able to approve it from past reading experience? That's a good question for both of you.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to take that, Megan?
Yeah, I guess my feeling would be like, you can't possibly, or I can't, maybe others can, you can't possibly screen everything your kids are going to read, especially if you have some voracious readers in your house who are just going to be bringing stuff home all the time. And so I think the key isn't to think about pre-screening, it's about establishing the relationship so that you can have a conversation about, well, what are you reading and what do you think about that? And you know, so that your kid will feel comfortable coming to you if something strikes them as off. You know, one of my kids is kind of a contrarian, and he'll sometimes come to me and be like, you wouldn't like what I'm reading now. And I'll be like, oh, really? You know, tell me more about that. And just to engage, have that space so that your kid can come to you and feel like they can talk to you about something that's troubling, upsetting, or that they don't quite know how they feel about it.
So
Yeah. Sorry, I would just also point you to the handout, which has lists for resources for a lot of different identities. So you can sort of screen that way with people who are from that background saying yay or nay.
Yeah, that's great.
And the handout did go out in the email, and I can send it to you again if you can't find it.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
And then initiating conversations about race with children who only like to read the funny or lighthearted books. That is my situation. And how can educators encourage caregivers to have conversations about race with their children when the caregiver has not explicitly asked for help with that? Those are two great questions. So for the children who prefer the funny or lighthearted books, just get lots of those kinds of books that have diverse representation. They'll notice, and you know, you can sort of slowly build up to having conversations. And it can just be sort of comparing different books or talking about the protagonist. What do you notice about this person? What do you notice about their friends? Look at the, you know, the cast of characters, that kind of thing. It doesn't have to get heavy and deep, you know, anytime soon. You can just, you know, notice and then sort of take it from there.
That makes me think my 5-year-old, I don't know how or exactly when this happened, but I remember taking a book out and he just looked at the cover and he goes, is this another beautiful book? I was like, probably. Like, I love a beautiful book. And I realized that's often how I would introduce him to a book. I'd be like, oh, this is such a beautiful book. So be mindful of how you're introducing books. Because yeah, he was like, can we just like read about a robot or something? And so, yeah, and follow their lead, you know, I mean, you don't want reading to feel like it's a chore, like serious business every time. You want to make it a shared space, really. That's what I think of reading with children as. It's just a space that you can occupy together for conversation, for bonding.
So it looks like we just have one more question, which is good because we have one more minute.
Great.
Do you have suggestions for talking to our kids' teachers? One of our attendees asked.
I think Megan can answer that because I have limited experience with kids in school.
I mean, talking to kids' teachers, like, I think, recognize that teachers right now are under so much stress and pressure. Like, I am in awe of what teachers are attempting to do right now. And so coming to them as, you know, a critic probably isn't going to feel great, right? Especially in this moment, but coming to them and saying, you know, I went to this webinar last night, they had all these great resources, I just wanted to share them with you, or go to EmbraceRace tomorrow and share their resources, they'll have a ton more. Like, teachers are going to love resources, right? Coming to them and saying, you know, how can I help? Like, I would love to share a book, or do you have room in your schedule where I could provide something? Or, you know, are you building a classroom library? How can I help get you resources? Like, support and resources, I think, are terrific. And then if your question is, how do you talk to a teacher when something problematic comes up? I think, you know, my line in my head is always like, I know you're dealing with a lot of kids, but this is my kid. Like, my kid. I have my eye on the ball with what my kid needs in a given situation. And if my kid needs me to intercede on their behalf, I do, and I'm not apologetic about it, because I'm what they've got, to make sure. And Autumn has the same voice, you know, that guided her toward homeschooling. She's what her kids have, in order to help them become the best version of themselves, that is self-confident and empathetic, and, you know, all the things that we want our kids to be. You're what they've got.
Wow. Well, we are so lucky that we have both of you. And I am so grateful that you were willing to speak with the Wayland community about these really important issues in a way that was so informative and so delightful. And your 5-year-old's going to laugh at me, but it was beautiful. Thank you so very much. And I have been recording this, so those of you who want to watch it again, it will be uploaded, I'm hoping soon, hopefully tomorrow, and be available on the, I can send you a link tomorrow or soon for the next 30 days. You can take a look at it, and it'll be on the Wayland YouTube channel as well. And the thank yous are coming in from the attendees also, and I just want to say thank you. And with that, I think we're going to end.
Having us. Thank you, everyone, for spending your evening on Zoom, which I'm sure we're all tired of.
I know, tired of Zoom, but it's what we've got, right?
Thank you, Pam. Thank you, Autumn. Thank you, everyone. This was really a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Okay. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.